저와 같이 걸어주실 거죠? Let's go. Every time I run, every time I run, every time I move, it's always for us. Every time I live, every time I live, every time I hold, it's always for us. Bodies can blow anywhere.
Stay in the air.
They go to high and I'm the tail. Come and stand up, yo, love in your face when I was home. Always wanna do not be got there. It's just one life, whatever you want. Go on home, whatever you want. You guys do, you need it, you need it. You're hoping you're in the devil, get everywhere. Every time I walk, every time I run, every time I move, it's always for us. Every time I live, every time I love, every time I hold, it's always for us. Every time I walk, every time I run, every time I move, it's always for us. Every time I live, every time I love, every time I hold, it's always for us. On the street when you ride, we try to fly. I'm out of your we try to cry. I'm the weed that you wanna know. Told a pin, poke it apart. You don't even know I got you like a chihuahua. Now I got a mom and I'm gonna listen to Joe. I know I got it real punk. What the hell is that? Yeah, I can you got to get it out and go to go to listen. Out of your head, go to the end. I'm just walking on the alright. What's it got to do? I'm lying on it, got to do it. Don't be got it, got dirty, you know who got it. Cause just when I'm lying, we won't leave with them. When I go, we'll leave with them. Every time I run, every time I run, every time I move, it's always for us. Every time I live, every time I love, every time I hold, it's always for us. That's it. Every time I run, every time I move, every time I run, every time I run, every time I move, every time I move, it's always for us. It's always for us.